what on earth is deconstruction? Right. I've been using this verb, the verb, to deconstruct, and certainly the noun deconstruction, quite a bit in these videos and in my lectures. And sort of like Derrida, I've been a bit cagey or evasive when it comes to uh, defining what on earth this word means, because I often find that when people outside of academia use the word deconstruct, or even when students use deconstruct, or even when some of my colleagues use the word deconstruct, we sort of mean it in a colloquial sense of just sort of taking apart, to instead of constructing something, deconstructing it, right? Taking it apart. Which really, in a sense, if that's all we mean by it, it would mean it would be a synonym for and would mean nothing other than simple analysis. That's what the word analysis means, to take apart in order to study how those parts work together as some kind of whole, right? That's not quite, at least what Derrida means by deconstruction. So if we understand deconstruction to be a mode of reading, a general mode of reading that we can extract and abstract from Derrida's analysis, specific analysis and critique of the binaries speech and writing and presence-absence. Instead of thinking for a second specifically about the deconstruction of these binaries, and try to generalize what he's doing in the book as a mode of reading texts, then we can begin to break down deconstruction into some component parts. Okay, and these component parts have had how they work together under this category called deconstruction, has had a great deal of influence in literary studies, especially in the 1980s and 1990s, though deconstruction certainly continues to have a great deal of influence, not only in the teaching of literature and literary theory, but also certainly in scholarship in a variety of fields within the humanities in general, and not just in English departments. So, so to the question, why should we care about Derrida and his deconstruction of presence and absence, one answer to that question is that we can abstract from it and generalize from it a theory and practice of deconstruction that can really travel, and that we can use as a mode of reading, whether we're reading, right, Paula Fox's Desperate Characters, whether we're reading Carol Mazo's The Art Lover, whether we're reading David Mitchell's Cloud Atlas, whether we're watching the sort of agonizing debates on television, they're not even debates, but the agonizing news stories involving the government shutdown, whether it's looking at Facebook status updates, whether we're thinking about sociological categories, whether we're thinking about the sciences or philosophy or history or what have you, that deconstruction as a mode of reading can really travel. And why? Okay. That question why then brings me to the sort of the sketching out of the steps of what a deconstructive reading of a text would look like. So the first two steps are actually pretty, well, the first step is actually the easiest, and then the steps get progressively harder as we go along. I'm going to break the incredible complexity of Derrida's of grammatology and his reading practice into 3 steps. Okay. Step number 1. In whatever text you're reading, whether it's a novel, whether it's a work of philosophy, whether it's a book of poetry. This is a book by my good friend Lisa Fay Cooley. Whatever it is, the first step would be to locate and identify for yourself as a reader particular binary oppositions. Okay? And a binary opposition, what do I mean by that? I mean simply two terms that are set up either explicitly or implicitly in an oppositional relationship. Okay. Now, Derrida's point about this point about analyzing binary oppositions is that opposing terms never exist, according to Derrida, in a never exist in a kind of neutral opposition or equal opposition to each other, right? Actually, I'm not sure if he claims that they never do, but I think he does claim that. For the sake, if it's a caricature of him, let's just let it be a caricature, that there is never a sort of neutral opposition of terms. Okay. And so, if we look at a book like Desperate Characters, Paula Fox's Desperate Characters, if we just think and meditate and ruminate for a second, we can come up with a whole assemblage of binary oppositions that this text sets up. Okay, as a novel, right? So, so white Americans, black Americans, a racial binary, white collar versus blue collar, a sort of class binary, as it were, peace and violence, normativity, rabidity, right, rabidness, human, animal, present, past, private property versus public space, cleanliness versus dirtiness or garbage, health versus infection or sickness, purpose or purposiveness versus aimlessness or pointlessness, renovation and ruin, gentrification and poverty, families or familial attachment, and strangers versus strangers. Okay, so I've just listed a ton of binary oppositions at work in this novel. Okay, so if I wanted to do a deconstructivist reading of Desperate Characters, I might focus on one or several of those binary oppositions and think about the relationships between them and how they and locate where in the text some really important moments of their interplay and their hierarchization come into effect. Usually, in most cases, when we think about binary opposition, it's the first term that is the privileged term, the first one that comes to mind, right? And so in that case, it would be white collar, peace, normativity, human, present, private, cleanliness, health, purpose, renovation, gentrification, family. These sorts of terms would be maybe not so much in the novel, but at least in the culture the novel is composing and expressing for us. Those are the privileged terms. Okay, so I hope that point is clear. That when reading a novel like Desperate Characters, that is not just a narrative, but in its own way a work of critique, that it would be a mistake to simply claim that in the novel itself these are privileged terms. We would have to argue that in the lives of the characters, in the cultural and social milieu it invents and represents and expresses, that it's in those circles, and less in the very texture of the novel itself, that those are the privileged terms. I want to say a bit about this at the end of the video, or near the end of the video. Okay. Anyway, so that's the first step, just listing, identifying, locating binary oppositions in whatever text you're looking at. Again, it doesn't have to be a novel. It can be a political debate, it can be a television advertisement, it can be a YouTube video, it can be a website, it can be my own teaching practices, if you were. All one has to do to really get started is to locate and identify binary oppositions. Step one. Step two. This part's a bit trickier. Okay. Step two would be to find moments in the text where the deprivileged term or the underprivileged term announces itself in a kind of in a strange and interesting way, announces itself, disrupting the hierarchization of the two terms and even turning them around. Right, so that for a second, right, it is It is violence. It is rabidity. It is animality. It is the past. It is the public space, right? It is sickness, right? It is the very terms that the cultural forces in this novel are attempting to exteriorize. What you're looking for are the moments when those exteriorized terms actually turn around and infiltrate and flip the hierarchy around. Okay. Now, this flipping is not a permanent thing. It is often happens in like a flash. It's often maybe just a glimmer, right, of a flipped hierarchy. It may have no ultimate or systemic effect on the lives of the characters themselves. But what we can argue is that they might not even register in the minds of the characters, but they are certainly registered and recorded and part of the very performance of the novel itself. Right. So if even in the lives of the characters, the moments where that hierarchy flips around is not registered or recorded or seems important, a deconstructivist reading would nevertheless locate and imbue with great significance that minor occurrence. Okay. So if you think back to chapter 1 in Of Grammatology, this is precisely what Derrida does when he looks at and stitches together a whole bunch of texts that use writing as a metaphor when attempting to explain what they mean by logos or by, some sort of divine or natural origin of all things, right? And so those are instances, Derrida will argue, where the exteriorized derivative term writing, right, which is underprivileged and deprivileged, sneaks back in somehow, maybe against the very intentions of those authors themselves, and sort of announces itself as primary, right, as necessary, as and Derrida will argue as the sort of non-originary origin of those very terms that the history of ideas has deemed foundational. That the foundational terms are derivative of some sort of primary writing. Okay, so I'm already indicating the next step here, but all I'm saying here is that Derrida locates in those moments of a figurative use of writing in order to express those foundational terms. He indicates those moments as moments where the deprivileged term writing comes back in and disrupts and reverses the hierarchy of those philosophical and scientific and theological systems. Okay. I'm using Derrida for an example here for a specific reason. Okay, when I'll maybe at the end I'll come back to either Carol Mazo or Paula Fox to show that when we do a deconstructivist reading of a novel, it may or may not, depending on what our purpose is, look very different from what Derrida is doing with those texts in Of Grammatology. Okay. So step 1, find binaries. Step 2, find moments where the binary seems, or the deprivileged term in the binary seems to announce itself suddenly in such a way that the hierarchy is disrupted and seems to flip around. These moments are usually marginal. They're sort of quick and sudden. They may not have a lasting systemic effect on the binary itself, right? The underprivileged term may flip for a second, but in the text it may go back to where it was before as well. Okay. That's step 2, finding those moments of flipping and disruption. So, I'm totally going to sneeze. Maybe not? No, here it comes. No, okay. Oh, goodness. Sorry about that. Okay. Step 3. This is the hard part. Step 3 requires a much more theoretical and creative rigor than the other much more creative rigor than the other steps. Because what one seeks to do in a deconstructivist reading in gathering together the moments in a text where a hierarchy is sort of flipped around or switched around, what one is attempting to do in a deconstructivist reading then is to show that in the very text itself, despite its potential intentions, despite the control it attempts to have over the world it's inhabiting and creating, that the system it's insisting on is always displacing itself, right? And that some other, what we might call system or some other logic or arrangement is at work instead. Okay, now that's very abstract and maybe even a little stupid, but let's just say then, to put it a bit differently, thinking about what Derrida does with the concept writing in Of Grammatology and how out of his analysis of writing he comes up with concepts like trace, difference, spacing, exteriorization, supplementarité, as we see in Chapter 5, which we'll be reading later in the semester. What we see then is that the task of a deconstructivist reading is not just the identification of those moments where the hierarchy flips, but a complete theoretical and practical reconceptualization of the minor term, of that very term that is menacing the entire system that those hierarchies maintain, right? A reconceptualization of the minor term. This reconceptualization usually takes on the appearance of a kind of a riffing or an improvising, sort of like you see in jazz, right? Using as its very tools the terms and concepts and prejudices and biases of the system itself, right? So one is attempting to find the moments when the system glitches, right? To put pressure on the moments where the system glitches and to use those glitches as the very tools for constructing a completely different, I hesitate to call it system, right? Because that's Derrida's point, is that what deconstruction doesn't do is just construct a new system or a better system. That's, again, not the point. But let's just say it constructs a completely different understanding of how things are working, okay, in whatever text that one is reading, okay. So this requires a great deal of insight and inventiveness and vision, right, as well as an agnosticism concerning the system one is dealing with and concerning the arguments that oneself is putting forward, right, a sort of self-agnosticism about the concepts that one is inventing. In other words, a kind of certainly a radical skepticism involving the system that one is attempting to displace, the system that contains all those hierarchies that are being critiqued and overturned, as it were, right? And so, in many senses, deconstruction requires a kind of critical attitude, right? Not just a capacity to find and to read those moments in the text itself, but actually, you know, a capacity, a mental capacity, an intellectual and even emotional capacity to doubt, and to be skeptical about, and to not so much distance oneself from, but to inhabit in a kind of incomplete way, without sort of a dogmatic adherence to any concept as foundational. I don't know how to end that sentence. Okay, so let's just say that deconstruction then requires the ability to notice binaries, to notice moments when binaries are disrupted or where the minor term seems to flip that binary around. It It requires a kind of critical and creative capacity to stitch together those moments and to improvise on them in just such a way that you show how the system is being displaced, how there's a completely different logic at work. Often a kind of work that's completely unnoticed by the author who's writing the work of philosophy or the novel or the one arguing a certain position. And it also requires a kind of agnostic attitude about the existence or the truth of the system that's being displaced, and certainly the work that one is claiming is actually going on in a kind of subterranean way. Okay. So when it comes to postmodern literature, now this comes back to the problem of why in a postmodern lit class should we care about deconstruction. A deconstructivist mode of reading is not so much something that we would bring to the text in order to criticize the binaries it's setting up. We could certainly do that if we want to. But the reason that I've assigned of Grammatology and put it between all of our novels this semester is that I want us to consider how the novels themselves are always already deconstructing the very terms that are operating in them, right? So if we go back to the list of binaries that I talked about in terms of desperate characters, is it not the case that there are all sorts of moments in the text, including when in some sense, the climax of the book, where the cat, early in the book, where the cat bites Sophie, right? Where the minor term announces itself, right, as a kind of, in a kind of privileged position, though in a perversely privileged position. And that in order to interpret the text, in order to try to extract from it a reading, in order to try to give an account of its argument, that what we see is that what we might begin to see is that deconstruction is not so much something we're doing to the text, but deconstruction, our mode of reading the text, is actually showing that deconstruction is something the novel itself is already doing, right? In a way, okay, not in as systematic a way as of Grammatology, but that we can actually see that that even in the very title of the book, Desperate Characters, that desperation is the very logic that's displacing the kind of the upper middle class, or even upper class, white collar, healthy, privileged positions of its characters. That this logic of desperation is precisely the deconstructivist system that's as a menace coming in from the outside, disrupting and desedimenting the lives of these characters and of the culture that is being depicted in the novel. Okay, we can say the same thing about the art lover, Carol Mazo's The Art Lover. I want to quickly read a passage that I believe one of you mentioned in class. I just gotta find it. Okay, this is on page 46 and 47. Okay, on the bottom of 46, after finding some matches from a Mexican restaurant called Caramba, with an exclamation point, at the very bottom, Caroline says, "Max, I never knew you to eat Mexican food out." Then on the next page, "Forgive this anger, coming out of nowhere, in a book of matches, in a change of hair. The day I got here, there was a glass bowl on the floor in the kitchen. The only thing I can think is her dog must have been thirsty." "Poor thing's parched, is it?" you must have said in your sarcastic way, shaking your head and looking for some old bowl. When I came in that day, there it was on the kitchen floor, a small glass bowl, half filled with water. it was only then that I finally cried. It's a passage like this, I think, where we can begin to see that in a novel like The Art Lover, we can find a rather brilliant work that corresponds to what Derrida is doing in Of Grammatology. In Of Grammatology, his primary purpose is to bring about the uncertainty and the deconstruction of presence, right? And to give a voice to a concept like trace, right? Trace, what Derrida will call in a different text, the being there of the absent. Okay. Likewise, we see here, I think, in The Art Lover, not so much a deconstruction of presence, but a deconstruction of absence in its own way, right? That a deconstruction of absence often through the meditation on objects, right? Literally on traces, on the traces of lives that have gone or are in the midst of leaving, on the meditations on the remnants of a life. This is not, I would say, in any way a religious or a Christian book, but I would say that in some sense what it's doing is attempting to theorize a postmodernist sense of resurrection. Not in any corporeal way or any spiritual way even, maybe a spiritual way, but again attempting to develop a logic of the being there of the absent. Right? That in every absence, in every death, right, there is a trace of the present. And that trace exists in unexpected and accidental places, and not just within psyches, but in encounters that the people have in the novel with objects and flyers and things that may actually have nothing to do with the characters themselves. Okay. All right, so that's meant to be suggestive. That's not by any means, a complete deconstructive reading of either novel, right? But those are some places to begin if we were to begin comparing and contrasting Derrida's work with the novels, at least, of Meso and Fox. Okay, so I hope that helps a little bit. In some following videos, I want to go back to Of Grammatology a little bit and maybe walk us through specific passages. I'm not going to read long passages, but specific short passages in which Derrida seems to give a definition of trace. And I want to sort of stitch these together so that because it's really only by stitching together, I think, distant and disparate passages in the novel that we really begin to learn how to move through it and to read it, as opposed to really sort of butting our heads up against the brick wall of specific difficult passages. Okay, so it's in those videos I want to suggest a different kind or a different mode of reading Derrida. Okay. All right, that's it for this one.